first sound wasn't his voice, but the crystal glass shattering against the field stone hearth. The wine, a vintage my husband had bottled the year our son was born, bled into the stone like a fresh wound. He hadn't come for a reconciliation, he'd come to collect. He slammed the door, and for 7 years the silence was absolute. No calls, no letters, nothing. Then at my husband's funeral, he materialized through the Oregon mist-polished Italian shoes, sinking into the damp soil, a suit so black it seemed to absorb the light, and in his hand a sheaf of papers that declared his intention to cleave our life's work in two. I froze, but it wasn't from the shock of his demand. It was the chilling, hollow ache of recognition. In that instant, I understood that my identity as a mother had been a shroud I'd wrapped myself in for so long, I'd forgotten the woman who lived underneath. And yet it was that profound betrayal that set me on a path I never could have foreseen, a journey back to the person I was before I ever answered to his name. I am Ilara Vance. I am 68 years old, and my bones are fused to this land, 800 acres of gnarled vines, rolling hills shrouded in fog, and a silence so deep it has its own weight. We call it sorrow. Vinecrest tourists who wind their way up the mountain pass see the rows of grapes clinging to the slopes and call it beautiful. But I have learned that beauty is often just resilience. Made visible, my husband Silas and I sculpted this place from bedrock and ambition. We arrived as kids, with nothing but a rusted pickup truck and a box of fragile experimental grape cuttings. Buren said would never survive the harsh Cascade winters. While our friends took cruises, we dug irrigation ditches until our hands bled. While they bought homes in the suburbs, we mortgaged our future on a prayer and a weather report. The day he walked out, watching the sky for the killer frost that could wipe us out in a single night. Over 45 years, this vineyard became more than our home. It was the tangible evidence of a shared vow proof that two people with enough grit could coax life from unforgiving earth and leave behind a story worth telling. We had one son, Kyle. He grew up with the scent of fermented grapes in his hair and the reddish-purple stains of harvest on his clothes he used to tear through the vine rows, his laughter echoing against the mountainside. A little king in his wild domain. I was so certain he loved this place, that its roots were tangled with his own. I believed he would be the one to carry its legacy forward when our hands grew tired. But a person's heart is its own uncharted territory. In his teens, the vineyard became a chore, then a burden. He started calling it your project, as if he were a visitor in his own life. The city beckoned with its promises of fast money, and an existence unburdened by seasons and soil. He left for Portland on a partial business scholarship and never looked back, treating the land not as a cradle, but as a cage. He'd finally escaped Silas. Ever the optimist would say, let him go. Ilara, he needs to find his own way. The vines will call him home for years. I clung to that hope like a vine to a trellis. I kept his room pristine, the sheets clean, his favorite coffee. Aging in the pantry, I would reread his last text message, a terse, loveless sign off Kyle, searching for a hidden warmth that wasn't there. Silas processed his grief differently. He retreated further into the quiet hum of the winery, into the scent of oak and aging wine. Some nights I'd find him in the barrel room, his hand resting on a cask, whispering to the darkness, as if the silence might answer back. The unspoken grief between us grew heavier than any harvest. Then came the night that shattered everything. The night the slap of his palm against my face was replaced by the crash of breaking glass. It was a frigid Tuesday in November, the wind howling down from the mountains, rattling the old farmhouse windows. Silas and I were sharing a quiet dinner, a simple stew, the comfortable silence of a long marriage filling the space between us. I remember seeing the exhaustion etched around his eyes, a weariness that went deeper than labor. Then we heard the sound of an engine too loud, too aggressive for our gravel road. I knew that sound. 7 years couldn't erase the arrogant growl of his sports car. He burst through the door without knocking his face pale and tight. his eyes burning with a feverish desperation. He looked older, thinner, wearing a designer suit that seemed alien in our rustic home. He ignored me completely, his gaze locked on Silas. "I need to talk business," he announced. His voice strained. He tossed a glossy folder onto our worn oak table. It slid across the wood and stopped beside Silas's plate. Inside were proposals contracts from a group of venture capitalists. They wanted to buy the lower 40 acres to develop into a luxury wellness retreat. The price was obscene. Cale launched into a frantic monologue about his failed startup, the debts piling up the life he was supposed to have living. In silence for 5 years, he needed this deal. Besides, he'd said with a dismissive wave of his hand, "What do 2 old people need with all this land? It's a waste." I told him we weren't selling. I tried to explain that the land wasn't a commodity. It was our history, our soul. I said we would help him find another way. But this was a desecration. That's when the rage boiled over. He accused me of always coddling him, then of siding with his father, of hoarding a future that he believed was his birthright. His hands were trembling. That's when he grabbed the wine glass from the table, the one from the 1995 vintage, the year of his birth, and hurled it into the fireplace. It exploded against the stone. Red wine, dark as blood, splattered across the hearth. Silas rose from his chair, his movements slow but absolute. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood between us, a silent, immovable wall. He looked at Kyle, his expression one of profound, bottomless sorrow, and said 2 words. "Get out." Kyle didn't fight. The rage seemed to drain from him, leaving behind something hollow and defeated. He turned and walked out, the sound of his engine tearing through the night until it was swallowed by the storm. Silas didn't speak. He just knelt and began picking up the larger shards of glass, his calloused fingers careful around the sharp edges. I brought a wet cloth to wipe the wine from the stone, but the stain remained a dark reminder of the wound that would never fully heal. I stood beside the grave, clutching the letter he had left for me in his bedside table, my hand surprisingly steady. I had read his words so many times the paper was soft as cloth. I had not cried yet. I had sealed the grief away in some cold, dark cellar of my heart. The service was nearly over when the sound of tires on wet gravel cut through the pastor's final prayer. A menacingly sleek black sedan, the kind you see in movies right before something terrible happens, slid to a stop near the winery. The door opened and Cale emerged, looking like a vulture in his bespoke suit. He wasn't alone. A woman followed him, sharp and severe, in a pantsuit that defied the mud, and behind her, a man in a rumpled suit carrying a leather briefcase. Kyle moved through our small gathering of mourners, not with deference, but with an unnerving sense of purpose. He waited for the final amen, then stepped forward right to the edge of his father's grave. He didn't touch the casket. He didn't offer a word. He turned to me, his eyes as cold and flat as river stones, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't the greeting of a son to his grieving mother. It was the signal of a predator to its prey. The man with the briefcase stepped forward and handed me a thick envelope. It wasn't a condolence card. It was a legal filing. Kyle was contesting the estate. He was demanding a 50% stake in the land, the winery, the equipment, and the entire inventory of aged wine, our life savings. Aging in oak barrels, he claimed that as the sole heir, and in the absence of a publicly filed will, he was legally entitled to half. I felt nothing. It was as if the cold drizzle had seeped into my bones and frozen my soul. The woman Serafina offered a smile. It was a small, tight thing that never reached her eyes, a flicker of triumph. This was going exactly as she'd planned. He had been our family lawyer for 30 years now, retired and living in a small cottage filled with books and the scent of pipe tobacco. He poured me a cup of strong black coffee and let the silence sit between us before he spoke. I pushed the envelope Kyle had given me across the table. Arthur read through the documents, his brow furrowed, His lips pressed into a thin, grim line. When did Silas update the will? He finally asked, his voice gentle. His shocking return. I told him the truth 2 years ago after the first heart attack. He'd written it by hand and we'd had it notarized. It was in the fireproof safe tucked behind our marriage certificate. Arthur let out a long, slow breath. That's good. Alara, that's very good. He explained that while the will was ironclad, Kyle could still drag this through the courts. Try to contest it by claiming we had manipulated Silas in his final years. It would get ugly. Public and expensive driving home through the thick evening fog, my headlights cutting ghostly tunnels through the mist. I felt a cold resolve solidify within me. Back at the house, I opened the safe. There it was. Silas's familiar, steady script filling the page. He left everything to me. Every vine, every bottle, every debt. Cale's name was not mentioned. Not once. I remembered the day Silas wrote it. The quiet pain in his eyes, he couldn't bring himself to disown his son aloud. But his pen had done what his voice could not. I didn't feel relief holding that paper. I felt a profound hollowness. This was not how I had envisioned protecting our legacy in a drawer beneath the safe. My hand found something I hadn't touched in years. My journals, page after page, of notes on the vineyard letters I'd written to Silas, but never gave him, and stories. Entries about Kyle's childhood, and one in particular written the night he threw the glass. I had recorded everything: the sound of the shatter, the look in his eyes, the smell of the wine soaking into the stone. I had documented the death of hope. That night, I made a copy of the will. I scanned the journal page. I sealed them in an envelope for Arthur. If Cale wanted a war, he would find me prepared. This wasn't about a grieving mother anymore. This was about the woman who had built an empire from dirt and was not about to let it be dismantled by the son who saw it only for its price tag. The official notice of proceedings arrived a week later. Seeing the court date printed in stark bureaucratic font felt like the start of a final countdown. I placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and stared out at the south vineyard where Silas had once tied bright red ribbons to the vines. He was worried about his small acts of hope. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The vineyard wasn't just land, it was my body's autobiography. Every scar in my hands from the trellising wire, every ache in my back from 1,000 harvests, it had raised me as much as I had raised it. I knew then. I wasn't just defending it from KL. I was reclaiming it for myself. The next morning, I made a call I hadn't made in a decade. Maya Petrova, she'd worked a harvest season with us in her youth before moving to Seattle and starting a consulting firm that helped small farms navigate legacy planning. She remembered me instantly. I told her everything: the lawsuit, the will, the soul-crushing ache of fighting my own son. She listened without interruption, and then she asked a question that changed everything, Alara. Have you ever considered putting the vineyard into a conservation trust? I hadn't. Not really, but as she explained it, a new possibility began to bloom in the barren landscape of my mind. A legacy. Trust would legally remove the vineyard from the realm of private inheritance. It was about standing for something that could not be bought or sold. The legal transfer to the Silas Vance Legacy Trust took 3 weeks of quiet, furious work. I moved with a singular focus, my grief channeled into a powerful current of purpose. By the time the court date arrived, Sorrowvine Crest was no longer my property. It belonged to a mission. I walked into the sterile, soulless courtroom wearing a simple navy dress and my grandmother's silver brooch, shaped like a grape leaf. Kyle was already there, his face a mask of detached confidence, when his lawyer laid out his claim of birthright and entitlement, painting Kyle as a wronged son seeking his fair share. I felt a strange sense of calm. Then Arthur stood. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply presented the judge with the notarized will and the official certificate of the land trust. He explained in calm, measured tones that the asset in question no longer existed in a form that could be claimed. The judge reviewed the documents Cale's lawyer stammered, and for the first time, the will, the lawyer, and the truth. Cale looked at me. The mask cracked beneath it was not anger, but sheer, uncomprehending shock. He had expected tears, a bitter fight, a negotiation he had never imagined I would simply burn the map. We left the courthouse without a word. Arthur walked me to my truck, his hand resting on my shoulder for a moment. It wasn't a celebration, it was an acknowledgement of a war ended and a life irrevocably changed that night. I slept with the windows open for the first time since Silas died. The wind moved through the house, and it felt not like a haunting, but a cleansing. 2 weeks later, an envelope was tucked into my screen door, no stamp, Kyle's slanted, rushed handwriting. It wasn't an apology. It was a tirade of shock and fury. He said I had stolen his future, that Silas would have never wanted this. He admitted he'd taken out a massive loan against his expected inheritance and was now facing financial ruin. I had, he wrote, burned the last bridge between us. I read the letter, folded it, and felt nothing. The anger was his to carry. That afternoon, I went to the attic and found a tin box of his childhood drawings, stick figure tractors, a lopsided sun beaming down on rows of scribbled vines. That boy was a ghost. The next day, I mailed him a single page. I told him I understood his anger, but that I had protected the only thing left that hadn't been poisoned by it. Then I let it go. The trust began to breathe life back into the vineyard. Students from the local community college started weekend internships. Maya helped me organize workshops on sustainable viticulture. One day, she asked if I'd give a talk on cold-hardy varietals. I stood before a small group in the barn, my voice shaky at first, and spoke about the vines. And as I spoke, I felt a part of myself dormant for years begin to stir. It was late November when he knocked on the door. It was Kyle. He looked haggard, his expensive suit replaced by a worn jacket. He stood on the porch, his shoulders slumped, unable to meet my eye. He told me he was dropping the appeal. He'd lost everything. He was broke. He asked, his voice barely a whisper, if there was any work, anything at all. I thought of the shattered glass, the lawsuit, the years of silence. But I also saw the ghost of the boy who loved this land. I told him a row of fence posts needed replacing before the ground froze. He just nodded and walked toward the barn. He started showing up, doing the hard, thankless jobs without a word. He turned the compost cleaned, the gutters, sharpened the tools. The volunteers watched him with suspicion, but I offered no explanation. One evening, he asked me about his father's last days. It was the first time he'd said his name. I told him the truth, that it was peaceful, that he died here on his land as he'd wished. Final reflections and life lesson. A few days later, a package arrived. A rare book on agriculture Silas had always wanted tucked inside was a note. I remembered we never spoke of it. But he started staying a little later. I saw him showing a young volunteer how to properly prune a dormant vine, his voice low and patient. There was no grand reunion, no tearful moment of forgiveness, but one night he stayed for dinner. We ate in silence, the quiet ticking of the old clock filling the space. It wasn't closure. It was something more fragile and perhaps more real. It was a beginning. I had learned that some things, when they are shattered, cannot be repaired, but they can be repurposed. The land was safe. Its story would continue, tended by new hands and by old hands finding their way back. And I, its guardian, had finally found my peace, not in holding on, but in transforming what was broken into something that could grow,